Over the last few weeks, we've been wrestling with the question, how to stay strong in one's faith when things are not going well? How do I continue to believe when my circumstances and everything about my life seems to be difficult? I look at society around me and everything seems to be falling apart. And it leaves me asking questions. God, where are you? Do you love me? Do you know my name? Do you care? And then, of course, when our circumstances are difficult, we easily equate that to an absence of God loving us. So for our study today, I want to begin with some images of a discovery made in Mosul in Iraq in 1849. Archaeologists discovered 7 clay tablets of the Enuma Elish, which you may have heard of before, also known as the Babylonian creation myth, named that because of its opening words. This discovery would give insight into a Babylonian worldview, the way they saw God, creation, and human beings. Then in 1893 and 1912, at an archaeological dig in Nippur, also in Iraq, portions of tablets were found written in the Sumerian language, how their God brought about creation. And as recently as the 1970s, different archaeological digs have discovered fragments of writings that depict different creation accounts. Why is this important to us, these fragments of text? Well, we'll get to that. But to build a case, we need to start with Paul's opening paragraph to the church in Ephesus. Paul writes to the church in Ephesus, and here's what he says. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in the heavenly realms with every spiritual blessing in Christ. For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. Remember, he's writing to Gentiles who had become Christians but have come from a pagan worldview and are now trying to sort through, how do I become a follower of Jesus? And the biggest transition and the biggest struggle for Gentiles who were enamored with the life of Jesus and the message of Jesus, the struggle for them was this whole idea of giving up everything they had been brought up to believe, giving up on everything that everyone around them still believed, and embracing the idea that there was only one God. This is difficult for us to comprehend because we are not polytheists. But remember, the entire world at the time were polytheists. Except for the Jews and some small pockets of Christians, everyone else believed in a pantheon of gods. So this idea that there was only one God, and whom you could call Father, was totally unthinkable. It was unimaginable because their understanding had always been every region and every nation, the Egyptians, the barbarians, the Greeks, the Romans, had their own gods. And even families had their own gods, normally ancestors. So when you moved from a place to another place, you just took your own gods with you. And when you got to your new place, you set up your family altar with your gods. And nobody cared what gods you worshipped or served. In fact, you might adopt a few gods from the region you were in. And at the time of the early church, the Roman Empire didn't care who you worshipped, as long as you paid homage to Caesar and as long as you did not dishonor the Roman gods. You could keep your household gods and you could keep your family gods. It just didn't matter. But then Christianity comes along and says, no, you have to give up all your gods. In fact, you should know this. In the 1st and 2nd century, Christians were considered to be atheists. Christians were seen as pagan because they didn't worship the pantheon of Greco-Roman gods. Or at best, from a Greco-Roman point of view, Christians had added a new God and then claimed it was the only God. The message of Christianity had something radically new, a completely new worldview. Paul highlights this a little later in his letter to them when he says, so I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. He's saying, because of their background as Gentiles, they had a worldview that matched the worldview of their culture, where they believed in multiple gods, polytheists. And that worldview was reflected in their behavior, just as our worldview will be reflected in our behavior. The text continues in verse 18. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Then he tells us why. And this seems a little offensive, but hang on. He's saying the people that you're interacting with in culture, they're ignorant due to the hardening of their hearts. Now this sounds like an insult, but it's not an insult. He's basically just saying, this is just my observation. The people that you deal with in culture, they don't know any better because they can't see what you see, because they can't see the world the way you see the world. Now let me explain why this is a big deal. In the culture of Ephesus, in Greek culture, because they believed in this pantheon of gods, these many gods. The gods, as you know, if you've read any Greek mythology, the gods are all about themselves. They do all sorts of crazy things. They toy with people. They slept with each other. There is castration. They cut each other in half. There are constant battles and violence among the gods. But the whole thing about the gods is the gods are about themselves. So to follow the gods meant you were all about yourself, every person for themselves. Right was determined by who had might, the strongest. Bad luck to be poor. It was certainly not good to be born a woman, and not good to be a conquered people. It's a winner-take-all world. Where did the pagans get that idea? That's how their gods operated. Now, the Apostle Paul is talking to some ex-pagans, those who before had been polytheists. Now he's saying, the world that you came from is very different from the world I'm introducing you to as a Christian. And your friends who still live in that world, they have a different worldview. Paul continues in verse 19. Having lost all sensitivity, they've given themselves over to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity. And they are full of greed. In other words, this is an anything-goes world morally, which was true in the pagan world, because there was no religious morality associated with paganism. Let me flip this around, and maybe it will help us see this. As a Christian, you know there is a morality that is associated with Christianity. How you treat people, we treat our spouse, faithfulness in marriage, all kinds of stuff. But in the Greco-Roman pagan religion, there was no morality. There was no behavioral expectations around their religion. So the Apostle Paul was saying, no wonder people in the culture behave the way they do. The reason they don't live the way I'm asking you to live is because they don't have the rules you have decided to live by. So it's not so much a criticism as an observation. He says, so as to indulge every kind of impurity and every kind of greed. Again, it's a winner-take-all world. They live for themselves, and whatever they can get, they get. And if you are a woman or a child, or if you're from a different country or have been conquered, it's just too bad. That's just how the world works. Paul continues on in verse 20. That, however, now the contrast, that, however, is not the way of life you learned. That greed, do whatever you need to do to get what you want. Treat people any way you want to treat them. He is saying that is the world you live in, but that is not the life you have been invited to. So he says, that, however, is not the way of life you learned. Just a quick side note on this. In today's world, one of the things that people who are not Christian fail to take recognition of is everybody, Christian or non-Christian, certainly in the Western world, live with the benefits of a Christian worldview. Early on in the first century, Christians were advocating what most of us assume today. You assume that people have individual rights. You assume that everybody has individual dignity. You assume that women should be treated with the same respect as a man should be treated with. You assume that the poor should not be exploited, that they should be given the same dignity and status and rights as rich people. You assume that sexual harassment and sexual abuse is wrong. Why do you assume that? You assume that because it is the leftover of Christian teaching that impacted the entire Western world, or impacted where Christianity has a foothold. Dignity of the individual is most pronounced in countries in our generation that were impacted by the message of Christianity. And that is not true in every culture in the world today. There are countries still today where women don't get to choose whether they can drive, or even choose whether they can walk down the road. In some countries, they have to have their husbands or their brothers walk with them. Young girls don't get to go to school. Yet where Christianity got a foothold, it impacted the culture of the place. And one of the ways it did was bring in this idea that men and women and children are made in the image of God, and therefore each person has intrinsic value. But when Paul was writing this, that was not the assumption. That was not the worldview of that society. In the Greco-Roman world, there were certain people at the top, known as the patricians or the equites, Roman citizens and so on, and others at the bottom, non-citizens and slaves. And the amazing thing is that the early church would come in and change that entire mindset and worldview. Now, what is interesting is when Gentiles encountered the gospel message and found out about this rabbi called Jesus, who was a Jew who had been crucified, who had been raised to life, they became interested in the sacred text of the Jews. Now, before Jesus came along, there was a tiny percentage of Gentiles that followed Judaism. Lydia was possibly such a person. Before she encountered Paul and became a Jesus follower, she is referred to as a worshipper of God. But for the most part, Gentiles did not follow the Jewish God Yahweh. Also, Jews kept to themselves. They don't go out to proselytize others into their faith. They would not intermarry. We know approximately 15 years after the resurrection, the Apostle Peter still had not entered a Gentile home and had probably never invited a Gentile into his home. It takes 2 visions to get Peter to go to the house of Cornelius, a God-fearing Gentile. As a whole, Jews stick to themselves. They had their own dietary laws, they kept the Sabbath, and as much as they could, they lived separated from the Gentiles. Now, in the first century, in every major Gentile city, there were pockets of Jews, in Ephesus, Rome, Corinth, Philippi. And where they settled, they kept to themselves. So Gentile people had virtually no interest in Jewish religion and no interest in the Jewish scriptures until they were introduced to the gospel and teachings of Jesus. And when they encountered the Apostle Paul and Peter and others who were with Jesus and eyewitnesses to the resurrection, it now became important to understand the Jewish text, known as the Law and the Prophets. It was not yet referred to by followers of Jesus as the Old Testament. It would only be called that much later. But they discovered that the Law and the Prophets was the backstory to this new story. Now they became interested in the Jewish text. They were not particularly interested in Judaism, but they were interested in finding Jesus in the text of the Jewish people. To their amazement, they began to realize that the Jewish people had always only believed in one God, Yahweh. Imagine when they opened up and unscrolled that first segment of the Jewish text called Genesis. Here is what they found. In the beginning, God. We have heard this so many times. We have read this so many times. We don't notice its impact. But from their context and background, from everything they would have known, what they would have expected to find was in the beginning the gods. In all the other creation accounts, it is always about the gods. Now, more recently, in the 19th and 20th century, those archaeological finds I mentioned earlier created doubt over the origins of the Genesis account. And here's where those doubts came from. And you may have been taught this at a theological college or university. If you have studied any ancient history, you may have come across this argument. When Egyptian, Sumerian, Babylonian, and Canaanite creation texts were discovered in the late 19th and early 20th century, they were seen to have some similarity to the Hebrew text. And because of this similarity, the initial assumption was this, that these ancient Hebrew texts may have actually borrowed from these other ancient creation stories. And of course, part of understanding the context of the Old Testament is to look at other ancient civilizations and to read portions of their text. And some parts had similar themes to Genesis. And so the assumption became the ancient Hebrews just borrowed from all these other stories. Then, of course, the argument being made is, this is just one of many stories on creation, and the Hebrew text is not unique. But what we need to know is, that view has been pretty much abandoned in current scholarship. Ancient history scholars now believe not only does Genesis not borrow from other creation stories, Genesis stands in startling contrast to other ancient creation stories. Genesis is a worldview unto itself. Let's examine why. For starters, the Bible opens with the line, "In the beginning God." The significance of what comes next is lost on us. But remember, this was first written to ancient Hebrew people, and all they had known is slavery. All they had known is the power of the Egyptian gods, the pantheon of Egyptian gods. And so the Hebrew text begins, "In the beginning God created," not Egypt's Amun-Ra, not Babylon's Marduk. In Genesis we find something extraordinarily different. Not even close, no similarity, no borrowing. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis is nothing like the Egyptian creation myths. It is nothing like the Canaanite creation myths. It is nothing like the Babylonian creation myths, where the gods are at odds with themselves, where the gods are at war with each other, where the gods actually create other gods and creation out of body parts and body fluids. In the Akkadian Babylonian creation account, the god Marduk, he rides into this epic battle on his 2 steeds, slaughterer and merciless. Marduk stands astride these 2 powerful stallions, and after defeating the goddess Tiamat by shooting an arrow into her mouth and through her throat, he splits her body in half, and with the upper half of her body he creates the heavens, and with the lower part of her body he creates the earth. It sounds absurd to us, right? But that is part of the Babylonian creation story, which is in the Enuma Elish. When humankind, men and women, are eventually created, about 5 books into the Enuma Elish, and then they are simply created to serve the lazy gods. This is how the Enuma Elish records it. Marduk says the following. This is actually a text from the Enuma Elish. This is what it says. "I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease. All of the ancient creation myths, mankind and womankind, are an afterthought, to take the load off, to lighten the load of the gods. And because of the way ancient people embraced these ancient mythologies about their gods, individuals had absolutely no rights. Women had absolutely no status. There is no intrinsic value in anyone. The violence and the injustice of the gods justified the violence and the injustice of their leaders. The kings were essentially acting like their gods in the heavens. And then you come to Genesis in stark contrast. It has no parallel, nothing even close. We're given a concept that the human race continues to struggle with to this day. Genesis tells us what no other pagan myth says. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image." In the Jewish text, the creation of humankind is the pinnacle, not the afterthought of creation. Which means that this is important. The dignity of every man, the dignity of every woman, the dignity of every child is established at the very beginning. This was unheard of. There was no parallel anywhere. None of the pagan mythologies saw people in this way. And then what comes next in the text would have been even more unimaginable for them. This is why later archaeologists and later scholars decided the Jewish text didn't borrow from any of these ancient myths. That this text is by far and away different from anything else. It's a worldview unto itself. The text says, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our own image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over," not worship, not make idols out of, not deify, "so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals." That in the very beginning, God told the Jewish people, "You will make no idols. You will make no idol of me, Yahweh. You will make no idol or image to worship out of animals or other people or anything that crawls on the ground or flies in the air. You will have no other gods before me." This in stark contrast to the Egyptian pantheon of gods that they had escaped from. God said, "You will not worship nature. You will rule over nature." The implications being, you will be the stewards of this world. An idea we still wrestle with to this very day. Every single pagan culture following the establishment of the Jewish people worship nature and the elements of nature and the animals of nature. From the very beginning, though, God established a unique worldview. God created humankind in his own image. And then the text says, repeated for emphasis, in the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. Right in the beginning, we see women are given equal status, something the world is still struggling to catch up with even today. Only in some cultures is dignity afforded to both men and women, and yet it was there in the very beginning. This ancient text gives us a radically unparalleled worldview, that we all bear the image, the thumbprint of our Creator. According to the Enuma Elish, you were born a slave to the gods. According to the Enuma Elish, you have no individual dignity, no individual rights. There is no Redeemer, and there is no afterlife. According to the new atheists of today, you were born a slave to your DNA. You have no free will. There is no Redeemer, and there is no afterlife. But in the very beginning, we are introduced to a God who saves, who redeems, who delivers, and never, ever, ever gives up on you. All of this in the very beginning. A God who gives us freedom to choose and then would go to work to reverse the consequences of our decision to choose against him. And when the time was right and everything was just as it needed to be, Yahweh, the God of Genesis, joined us, took on human form in order to save us. Genesis 1 provides us with the big picture, the ultimate context for human experience, a monotheistic worldview, and a worldview that answers life's most important questions, the why questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? Or more personally, what we're looking at today, why are you here? And why do you matter? From the Genesis account, we learn that you are here on purpose. You are not a result of some cosmic conflict between the gods, and you were not created by the universe. God wanted image bearers who could know and relate to one another, and image bearers that could know and relate to him. May your whole life be a response to the truth that the Creator of the universe sees you as valuable. And may you have a profound sense that you are created a person of dignity and you bear your Creator's image. And may you have the confidence and the assurance that your life is lived in the context of a God who loves you, no matter what you may be going through. Amen. As always, there are some questions following that hopefully will allow you to continue to wrestle with the text. And thank you for watching. Bless you.